They laughed when he kept his 1947 tractor. When the fuel crisis hit, he was the only one working. The summer of 1969 came in dry across Crawford County, Iowa. Corn was shoulder high by the 4th of July, standing without wind in the flat heat. The smell of diesel exhaust followed every farm machine across every gravel road from sunup to dark. Galen Pruitt turned 54 that June. He had been farming the same 240 acres 3 miles northeast of Denison since 1953, the year he bought the ground from his uncle for $82 an acre. The farmstead sat low off the road, a white clapboard house with a broken screen door spring, a 3-sided cattle shed along the east fence line, and an equipment shed farther back, south-facing, with a corrugated tin roof that popped and groaned through the summer afternoons. The tractor lived in that shed. It was a 1947 International Harvester Farmall M. Galen had bought it second-hand from a retiring farmer in Woodbine for $850. 6 years after the machine was built. The paint had already started fading by then, the bright red gone to dull rust orange across the hood and the rear fenders. He had run it through 16 planting seasons and 16 harvests by the summer of 1969. The block lettering on the hood was still readable if you looked carefully. The 4-cylinder C248 engine ran on gasoline. Galen kept it tuned, changed the oil every 100 hours, cleaned the air filter each spring, rebuilt the magneto twice over the years. The machine started on the 2nd or 3rd crank of the electric starter. It settled into a particular idle he had heard 4,000 times. A low, slightly off-rhythm knock. Just how that engine sounded when it was warm and running right. In the summer of 1969, Crawford County had mostly gone diesel. The John Deere 4020 was the machine everyone was buying. 91 horsepower, 6-cylinder diesel. The Sunderland Implement dealership in Denison had 8 on the lot that spring at $9,200 apiece. Harlan Voss, who farmed 580 acres 4 miles west of Galen's place, bought one in April. He was the 5th man in the county to do it. By midsummer, 11 4020s were working within 8 miles of Galen's farm. You could hear them on still mornings from across the fields. A higher pitch than the old gasoline machines, smoother. The particular sound of something that cost $9,200. Galen went to Sunderland Implement in June. Walked the lot for about 20 minutes. The 4020 smelled of fresh paint and new grease. He asked the salesman about fuel consumption under field load. 5 to 6 gallons per hour, the salesman told him. Galen wrote the figure on a feed store receipt he pulled from his shirt pocket, added the purchase price, the financing rate, the estimated first-year service cost, folded the receipt, put it back. He drove home. He had not bought anything. That August at the grain elevator in Denison, 3 men were standing near the scale house when Galen pulled in with the Farmall M and an empty wagon. Harlan Voss was one of them. Ray Callahan, who farmed a section just south of the township line, was another. The third was a younger man named Denny Hoffman, who had started farming his father-in-law's 180 acres that spring. Voss said something when Galen climbed down from the tractor. Galen didn't repeat it at home that evening. He told his wife only that it had to do with the Farmall M and the year 1947. He unloaded his grain, drove home. That fall, the county extension office sent a bulletin. Earl Saunders, the Crawford County Agricultural Extension agent, had written it. 4 pages. It laid out the economics of modern diesel equipment against older gasoline machines. New engines burned fewer gallons per hour. Diesel cost less per gallon than gasoline in Iowa that year. The break-even on a new tractor purchase for a 200-acre operation, 7 to 11 years. For 300 acres, 6 years. Galen read it at the kitchen table. set it on the shelf above the wood stove. He had his own numbers. The Farmall M burned 2.1 gallons of gasoline per hour under field load. He had tracked this himself in the spring of 1967, keeping a pocket notebook on hours logged against gallons consumed over a full week of spring tillage. Annual field work for 240 acres, spring plowing, planting, cultivation, fall work, grain hauling, ran 160 to 180 hours of tractor time per year. At 2.1 gallons per hour, approximately 340 gallons of gasoline annually. The machine had cost $850 in 1953. 16 years of operation. No debt. He kept a 250-gallon above-ground gasoline tank bolted to a frame on the north side of the equipment shed. His father had kept one there, his grandfather before that. Every fall, after harvest, Galen drove to town and filled it to the top. Gasoline cost 32 cents per gallon in October of 1969. He paid $80 for 250 gallons. The number in the extension bulletin was $9,200 for a new machine, plus estimated finance charges. The number on Galen's fuel receipt was $80 for the year. The tractor was paid. The tank was full. The following 3 seasons were dry and productive. Crawford County set corn yield records in 1971. The big diesel tractors planted more acres, cultivated more efficiently, brought in larger harvests. Harlan Voss's 580 acres yielded 118 bushels per acre that fall. By the spring of 1970, he had broken 140 acres of old pasture into corn production and was farming the whole place with the 40/20 and a rented cultivation tractor. Ray Callahan bought an EH-1066 diesel in March of 1971, 116 horsepower, $10,600. Denny Hoffman borrowed against his father-in-law's equipment to get a used 40/20 with 800 hours on it that same spring. The county was adding diesel tractors at roughly 1 per week. Galen's 240 acres yielded 107 bushels per acre in 1971. His Farmall M had cost nothing that year beyond fuel and a set of ignition points he put in himself on a Tuesday morning in April. The machine ran without trouble through planting, cultivation, and fall work. He logged 174 hours of seat time for the year, used 365 gallons of gasoline, paid $127.75 in fuel costs for the entire growing season. At the Denison feed store in April of 1971, 2 men from the south end of the township were buying seed corn when Galen came in for a 50-pound bag of mineral supplement. One of them asked, loud enough to carry across the store, whether the old M had given up yet. The other said keeping a 1947 anything was like farming in a museum. Galen paid for the supplement, loaded the bag in the truck. The Farmall M sat in the shed when he got back. He checked the oil on the dipstick, added a half-gallon of water to the radiator. The hot months always pulled a little from it. Set the choke, turned the key. The starter cranked twice. The engine caught on the second crank, rough at first from the cold morning air, then settling into that familiar idle within 30 seconds. He let it run 8 minutes before pulling it to the east field. Spring tillage took 9 days, 168 acres, 38 hours of seat time, 79 gallons of gasoline. He drove to the co-op in Denison the following week and replaced what he had used. Paid $27.65. Earl Saunders from the Extension Office stopped at Galen's farm in August of 1971. He was making county rounds, noting which operations had modernized and which had not. He stood in the equipment shed for several minutes looking at the Farmall M with the look officials get when they have already formed their conclusion. He asked Galen about plans to upgrade. Galen said he had no current plans. Saunders wrote something in his notebook, said something about productivity benchmarks and the county's agricultural development index. Left after 12 minutes. The Farmall M was 24 years old that summer. The engine had logged about 11,000 hours. Galen had rebuilt the carburetor once in 1965. Ignition points replaced 3 times. Clutch relined in 1968, $62 in parts. Total expenditure on the machine since 1953, $214 in parts and purchased materials, plus his own labor. His father had told him once that a machine you know is worth more than a machine you don't. He had thought about that more than a few times over the years. By fall of 1972, he was the only farmer he knew of in his section of Crawford County, still running a pre-1955 gasoline tractor as his primary field machine. He heard about it at the grain elevator, the way information traveled in a county where everyone bought supplies at the same 3 places and talked while they waited on their grain tickets. The general impression, as it reached him, was that he was either too stubborn or too set in his habits to see what modern farming looked like. He filled the 250-gallon tank in October of 1972, same as always. Gasoline was 36 cents per gallon. He paid $90. The tank sat against the north side of the shed through the winter, full, same as it had been every winter since 1953. October came again in 1973. A cold front moved in from the northwest on the 14th and settled over Crawford County for the better part of a week. The corn was ready. Galen had 240 acres to bring in. The Farmall M sat in the equipment shed, serviced and tuned from the summer work. The farm tank held 250 gallons of gasoline. On October 17th, the Arab oil-producing nations announced an embargo on petroleum exports to the United States and several allied countries. The announcement reached Denison by radio before noon. It reached the grain elevator by mid-afternoon, when the elevator manager started calling the fuel distributor in Carroll. The distributor in Carroll was already fielding calls from every grain elevator and implement dealer in western Iowa. By October 25th, diesel allocations to Crawford County had been cut to 40% of normal delivery. The county co-op mailed notices to all member farm operations that week. Each farm would receive a monthly rationed allotment based on prior usage history and reported acres in production. Harlan Voss's November allocation, 180 gallons of diesel. His IH combine burned 4.8 gallons per hour under harvest load. His 4020 burned 5.9 gallons per hour in typical field conditions. Together, running a full 12-hour day, they consumed roughly 64 gallons. 180 gallons would last him 2 days and about 20 hours of combined machine time. He had 580 acres of corn standing in the field. Voss called the co-op on October 28th. Was told that an emergency supplemental allocation form was available by mail. Review period, 4 to 6 weeks. The corn on his North 80 was already at 13% moisture and dropping through the dry October air. Rain was forecast for the first week of November. Wetter corn meant drying costs at the elevator. At 9 cents per bushel per percentage point of moisture above 15.5%, a significant wetting would add several $1,000s across his remaining 420 acres. He sent in the emergency form. Ray Callahan had 320 acres of corn and an allocation of 140 gallons. His H-1066 burned 6.2 gallons per hour under full harvest load. He worked the numbers on a piece of paper at the kitchen table the evening of October 28th. Didn't call the co-op for 5 days. Called on November 3rd after burning his remaining on-hand diesel to finish a field he had started before the notice arrived. Galen started his harvest on November 1st. The morning was 27 degrees at dawn. Still air, no wind. The equipment shed smelled of cold iron and old motor oil and the faint gasoline smell that always came from the farm tank when the temperature dropped. Galen climbed up on the Farmall M, set the choke, turned the key. The starter cranked twice. The engine caught on the second crank, a rough bark at first, then settling into that low, uneven idle within 30 seconds. He let it run 9 minutes. Checked the oil pressure gauge on the dash. Stepped down to check the picker attachment fittings and the wagon hitch pins. He pulled out of the shed at 7:04 in the morning. The corn came off dry, 14% moisture. He ran the one-row corn picker from 7 in the morning until dark. 9.5 hours of seat time. Covered 38 acres the first day. Burned 20 gallons of gasoline. He had 290 gallons total between the 250-gallon farm tank and 40 gallons he had bought at the Murphy station in Denison on October 30th. He had not been thinking about the embargo when he bought those 40 gallons. The truck gauge was running low. He bought gasoline when the gauge was low. Had done it for 20 years. 2 miles west, Voss's combine sat in the machine shed. Diesel tanks dry. The emergency form was somewhere between Denison and the co-op processing office in Carroll. Galen worked through the first week of November. The Farmall M pulled the one-row corn picker in steady passes across each field. Slow by the county's current standard, 1 row at a time, roughly 2 acres per hour in good field conditions. But running. Every morning, set the choke, 2 cranks of the starter, 9 minutes of warm-up, then pull to the field. He had run it this way for 20 years. He knew how long the warm-up needed in November cold. He knew what the oil pressure should read at operating temperature. He knew the sound it made when it was right, and the sound it made when something needed attention. Nothing needed attention. 3 days after Galen started his harvest, the radio was reporting that grain elevators across 6 Iowa counties were sitting on uncut corn, with no diesel fuel to bring it in. Every day of delay was a compounding problem. Wet weather in November meant higher moisture content at the elevator. Higher moisture meant drying costs. A wet winter with corn still standing was a loss that didn't fully recover. On November 6th, the Farmall M starter took 3 cranks instead of 2. Galen climbed down that evening and cleaned the battery terminals with a wire brush and a thin paste of baking soda and water. Left the terminals dry overnight. The next morning, 2 cranks. By November 8th, he had 158 acres cut. 82 to go. The county extension office posted its weekly harvest completion report. Crawford County, 31% complete by November 8th. The 3-year average for that same date was 77%. The difference was fuel allocation and what happened to be running when the embargo hit. He finished his own harvest on November 9th. 240 acres. The last wagon load came off the back 40 at 4:45 in the afternoon. He put the picker in the shed and washed it down with the yard hose. The water was just above freezing. It pulled the warmth from his hands through his work gloves inside of 3 minutes. He finished the wash, coiled the hose on its wall bracket, went inside. His wife had supper on the stove. He sat down, ate. He didn't say much about the harvest being done. She knew. The farm tank still held 127 gallons. The next morning, Harlan Voss's truck came into the yard before 8 o'clock. Voss got out and stood by the driver door with the frost still on the ground around him. He had 420 acres of corn standing and no diesel to cut it with. He looked at the equipment shed for a moment. Then they went inside. At the kitchen table, Galen listened. Voss talked. The conversation lasted about 15 minutes. Galen could not give Voss diesel. The Farmall M ran on gasoline, and there was no overlap. But the Farmall M could pull a plow. could work Voss's fall tillage, while Voss waited on his emergency allocation and figured out how to get his corn in through December, if it came to that. They settled the terms. Galen would plow and disc 120 acres of Voss's east fields with the Farmall M and his 3-bottom plow. Voss would pay 85 cents per acre, plus 2 months of grain storage credit at the elevator. Total, $102 in cash and the storage. Galen started on Voss's east ground on November 11th. The soil had gone cold and firm in the top 4 inches, still workable below that. He set the 3-bottom plow to 8 inches and held ground speed at 2.4 miles per hour, the pace that kept the plow from chattering and kept the furrow walls tight. The Farmall M pulled steadily, 2.1 gallons per hour. He worked 10-hour days, covered 14 acres the first day, 18 acres the second, where the ground ran softer along the drainage near the creek. The tractor didn't labor, didn't overheat, started every morning on the second crank of the starter. Ray Callahan came to Galen's place on the evening of November 14th. He had 180 acres of corn still standing and a used-up fuel allocation. He pulled into the yard and sat in his truck for close to 2 minutes before he got out. Asked if there was any possibility of getting some plow work done on 80 acres, Galen said he could fit it in when Voss's ground was done. Denny Hoffman came on November 18th. He had driven past the operation on the county road 3 times that week, slowing each time to watch the Farmall M working Voss's field. On the 3rd pass, he turned in, stood near his truck, said he needed help. Galen said he'd be there by the 20th. By the evening of November 17th, Galen was running the Farmall M 10 hours every day across 3 properties in rotation, burning between 18 and 22 gallons of gasoline daily. He laid his fuel situation on a piece of paper at the kitchen table that night. Farm tank remaining, 147 gallons. Running at 20 gallons per day, 7 1/3 days. He needed 9 to finish what he had committed to. The next morning he drove to Denison early, before most people were moving. The Murphy station had regular gasoline, but with a 10-gallon limit per customer. He bought 10 gallons. Drove to the farmer's elevator on the east edge of town. They had 48 gallons of white gasoline purchased before the embargo for equipment cleaning purposes, not covered under the farm fuel rationing system. The elevator manager sold him 30 gallons at 42 cents per gallon. Galen paid $12.60 in cash. He added the combined 40 gallons to the farm tank. New total, 177 gallons. At 20 gallons per day, nearly 9 days. He made the math work. Voss's 120 acres of plow ground were done on November 19th. Callahan's 80 acres were done November 22nd. Hoffman's 40 acres were done November 24th. The last full day the soil stayed workable. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees that night. By the next morning, the ground was frozen to 6 inches. Galen put the plow in the shed, parked the Farmall M beside it. The tractor had run every day from November 1st through November 24th. 24 straight days of field work across 4 different farms. The only mechanical issue in that entire stretch, a frayed throttle cable on November 16th. He replaced it with a spare from the parts shelf at the back of the shed. The cable cost $1.40. He had bought it in 1969 as a backup. 2 more identical cables sat on the same shelf. Crawford County's harvest completion by December 1st, 87%. 2 counties to the south finished at 59% and 62% respectively. The figures appeared in Extension Office records. No newspaper covered the difference or the reason behind it. Galen's 240 acres had come in at 14% moisture. No drying costs. He sold at $2.14 per bushel in November, before the price dropped to $1.88 in mid-December. Voss got his emergency diesel allocation in the first week of December. He ran his combine through the remaining 420 acres of standing corn into January, working the days the weather allowed. Some of that corn came in at 21% moisture after the wet weather in November. Drying charges at the elevator, $0.09 per bushel. On 37,800 wet bushels, that came to $3,402 in costs he had not planned for. Earl Saunders from the County Extension Office filed his annual report in January of 1974. Under a section on supply chain disruptions in agricultural operations, his report noted that farms running pre-1960 gasoline-powered equipment had continued field work without interruption during the November diesel shortage. He listed one specific operation: Galen Pruitt, Crawford County, 240 acres, 1947 Farmall M, 4 sentences. He did not send Galen a copy. By 1975, 4 other farmers in Crawford County had held onto old gasoline tractors rather than trading them. All 4 said, when asked directly, that November of 1973 was why. None said Galen's name publicly when they explained it. At the feed store and the grain elevator, in conversations between men buying seed and men picking up their grain tickets, people in Crawford County generally understood where that thinking had started. The second oil shock came in 1979. The Iranian Revolution disrupted exports through the spring and summer. Diesel fuel in Crawford County reached 82 cents per gallon by August, up from 42 cents the year before. Allocation problems returned, not as acute as 1973, but enough to slow diesel operations through parts of the fall. The men running older gasoline equipment worked through it without interruption. In Crawford County, their combined operations, roughly 800 acres across 4 properties, came in complete by November 15th. Diesel operations county-wide ran an average of 18 days behind schedule. According to the Extension Office annual report for 1979, a younger farmer named Tom Raymond from east of Dow City had bought an old Farmall Super M in 1977 after hearing the 1973 story from his father-in-law, who had watched Galen work Voss's ground that November. Raymond's fall tillage was done before his neighbors got their fuel deliveries sorted out. Galen was 64 in the fall of 1979. The Farmall M was 32 years old, still 240 acres. The engine had been rebuilt once, in the summer of 1976, by a mechanic named Carl Detweiler, who ran a small engine shop on the south end of Denison. Detweiler charged $340 in parts and labor. The tractor came back starting cleaner than it had in years. The 250-gallon tank on the north side of the shed was filled every fall. Gasoline was 89 cents per gallon in October of 1979. Galen paid $222.50. His total annual fuel expenditure for 240 acres of field operations, approximately $315. Galen Pruitt farmed his 240 acres in Crawford County through the 1991 season. His last harvest. He was 76 years old. His son-in-law, Dennis Wahlberg from Ames, took over the operation in the spring of 1992. Wahlberg had grown up on farm ground in Story County and spent 14 years as a regional parts manager for an implement distributor before returning to farming. He knew old equipment and knew what to look for. He went through the shed on his first day, found the Farmall M in the back corner. Faded orange-red paint, rust on the hood and the front casting, block lettering still readable at close range. He climbed up, set the choke, turned the key. 2 cranks of the starter. The engine caught. Settled into that old uneven idle, a low, slightly off rhythm knock that Galen Pruitt had heard 400 times and that Wahlberg had just heard for the first time. Wahlberg used the machine for another decade. Light work around the place, fence row mowing, moving materials, running the small disc on the garden plots. In 2001, the carburetor began flooding cold starts. He rebuilt it himself on a Saturday morning in February using a kit from a parts supplier in Omaha. $38, 3 hours at the workbench in the equipment shed. The following Monday, the Farmall M caught on the second crank, same as it had for 50 years. Galen drove past the farm on the county road in 2004. He was 89 years old. His daughter was driving. He looked toward the equipment shed as they went by on the gravel. Corrugated tin roof, the same roof that had popped and groaned in the summer heat in 1969 when the whole county was buying diesel tractors and saying what Galen ought to do. He didn't ask to stop. Didn't need to. The Farmall M was in there. 57 years old. Same engine, rebuilt twice. Same starting procedure, set the choke, turn the key, 2 cranks. The men at the grain elevator had said their piece in 1969. The county extension office had written 4 pages on the subject. The fuel crisis of 1973 had stopped diesel equipment across 3 counties for 6 weeks. The 1947 Farmall M had worked through all of it. Every morning it needed to start, it started. Still in the shed. Still running. Still just an old Farmall and a full tank of gas.